What is going on, guys? Welcome back to another video. And believe it or not, we are only 12 days away from the 2025 trade deadline. I know that sounds absolutely crazy considering we just had four nations. We are getting right back into the thick of it. So I decided to ask you guys on my Instagram, MB on Hockey. Feel free to go follow that so you can submit these in to send me your hypothetical, realistic trade deadline trades. Because when looking at it, a lot of the top rentals have been traded thus far, but there are some big names potentially still on the market. Looking at Brock Nelson, Ivan Provorov, Kyle Palmieri, as well as guys that have some term that potentially could get traded. Alex Tuch comes to mind. Rasmus Ristolainen has been on the market. Scott Laughton has been on the market for like 2 to 3 years at this point. But we're going to go through it. We're going to go through some of those names and see if we got any good deals. Basically judge like if the price is good, if the fit's good. Let's get into it. Let's not waste any time. Up first from Leo, he says Ryan O'Reilly for Dawson Mercer. And yeah, when looking at the New Jersey Devils, they lost to Dallas, who's probably a better team than them or an overall more balanced team than them last night. But it has not been good for the New Jersey Devils basically since like the new year. They've been like about a 500, I think maybe even below a 500 team. Still probably going to make the playoffs, but if they want to be any semblance of an actual contender, they might have to do something at this deadline. Something this drastic would, I don't know if I would fully do that, considering although Ryan O'Reilly is without a doubt a better player right now and has 2 more years after this at a reasonable, dirt cheap $4.5 million. Giving up Dawson Mercer for like a 35, 36-year-old that could hypothetically fall off at really any point might be a little bit too much, but I do think injecting Ryan O'Reilly, injecting that leadership, that winning culture into the team could potentially be a fix for this season. But again, Dawson Mercer is still only like 23 years old, although he's been disappointing this season. He only has 25 points in 58 games. I'm not sure I'm ready to boot him off the team, give up on him quite yet. Maybe if I'm Nashville, honestly, I'd attach like a third or maybe even a second round pick to get this deal done, considering this would be them signaling that they're going to do this rebuild and retool, and that would be awesome asset management. Because if you trade Ryan O'Reilly, you probably would get a first round pick, but I'd much rather have Dawson Mercer, who at the bare minimum is a very effective third liner at this point. But yeah, pretty interesting deal. I like that. It definitely makes sense for both parties. I'm just not sure if I would quite do that if I was the New Jersey Devils right now. It's not like although there's a lot of pressure on them, it's not like it's like this year or bust. Their window is still very wide, and Dawson Mercer is hopefully going to be a part of that for the next decade or so. Next up from the Block James, friend of the channel, he says Donato to Ottawa for a 3rd and a 7th. I think if you make this a 2nd round pick, it could make sense. Donato is like sneaky killing it, and yes, part of that is because he's on Chicago, where he's relied on to be like the 2nd or 3rd best forward on the entire team. If he gets traded to an actual playoff team like the Ottawa Senators hopefully will be, or especially a contender, he'll be more so of a 3rd liner. But yeah, he has like 39 points in 54 games thus far. So I think he's definitely getting a 2nd round pick. Don't think he's probably not getting a 1st round pick. But yeah, 2nd and a 7th, 2nd and 6th could make a lot of sense. And if you're the Ottawa Senators, with the health problems that they have had this season, especially to guys like Shane Pinto, Josh Norris, it makes sense to bring in a guy like Ryan Donato. So yeah, that makes sense for both parties. I think Chicago probably should move off him. I believe he's an expiring guy. Are you going to give Ryan Donato the 5x5 that he probably could demand on the open market at this point? I'm not so sure. He's 28, 29 years old. So another very good deal for both parties. Next up from Easton, he says more Turcotte in a 2nd for Alex Tuch. Alex Tuch did get hurt last night, but I as of right now, it's not anything too serious. And there's been a lot of smoke around him with the LA Kings. I believe there was a tweet over the weekend regarding that. So yeah, Turcotte, what was that exactly? Let's pull it up again. Turcotte, more in a 2nd. Could make sense. Could definitely make some sense when looking at Alex Turcotte has really come alive this season. So if you're the Buffalo Sabres, you have Alex Tuch under contract for this year and next at $4.75 million. But obviously not making the playoffs this year. And next year, you're probably not much of a threat. So you get a little bit younger. You got a guy like Trevor Moore that's a good veteran presence, as well as a 2nd round pick. Although, yeah, I'm not sure Turcotte's ever going to turn into Alex Tuch. It could make some sense if Alex Tuch's like, yeah, I might explore the unrestricted free agency market. And if not, I want some like 8x8.5, 8x9. LA could afford it this season, and basically maybe it's a 1.5 year rental. Maybe they don't plan on re-signing Alex Tuch when he's 29 years old, but they need some offensive oomph in their forward. The forward core is very good, don't get me wrong, but Alex Tuch would immediately become the 3rd best forward, arguably 2nd best forward. Next season, probably the 2nd best forward if Anze Kopitar regresses a little bit. Definitely interesting. We got another Alex Tuch trade with the LA Kings being Jordan Spence, Trevor Moore, and a first for Alex Tuch. I think you could potentially bump that down to a second-round pick just because I'm decently high on Jordan Spence. And that also would make some sense for Buffalo, considering Jordan Spence is a right-handed defenseman. They have their 3 lefties that they're probably going to have to move off Bowen Byram eventually. So that's another deal that makes some sense. Buffalo gets a pretty much established young guy that has some potential, has the potential to reach 80-90% of Alex Tuch, as well as getting a pick. That would not be the worst deal in the world for Buffalo if they end up trading Alex Tuch. Next up, Mark Gallant, 28. Rakell to Minnesota for Liam Ogren in a second-round pick. I think if you're Minnesota, you could probably only give up a third-round pick in this situation because Liam Ogren does have a lot of value. He's clicking at around like a point per game in the AHL this season. If you're Pittsburgh, yeah, I think you easily do this. Rakell, although he's killing it this season, similarly to what was I talking about before, Buffalo, but even more so, Pittsburgh's probably not sniffing the playoffs the next 2 to 3 years. Rakell has 3.5 years left on his deal. Yeah, it just goes back to the Mercer, but Ogren's obviously not established as much as Mercer. If you're Minnesota, are you ready to sell on Ogren? Obviously, this depends on, do you think Kaprizov's going to come back this season? Because if not, you're probably not buying at this year's deadline. Does make sense for both parties. If Rakell is like 3 to 4 years younger, I think I really would pull the trigger on this. His age is a little bit concerning, although he bounced back in a solid way. Yeah, I think maybe you just do a first-round pick for Rakell. This year's first, or they don't have this year's first-round pick because of the Yurchek trade. 2026 first-round pick, just because Ogren potentially next season could be a serious impact guy. Minnesota's just giving up a little bit too much in that, even it being Rakell and Ogren straight up. Awesome deal for Pittsburgh, in my opinion, if they somehow got that done. Jack says Oilers get Provorov for a second and a third-round pick. You got to turn that second into a first-round pick. Provorov is by far, now that Pettersson's not on the market, the best rental defenseman in the entire NHL. It's not remotely close, considering what he brings to the table in terms of physicality, and he has been pretty good in Columbus the last season and a half. Yes, in Philadelphia, when he was miscast as the number 1, playing 25 minutes a night, 24 minutes a night. He struggled. He struggled on bad Philadelphia teams, but this guy is very, very good in Columbus and can walk into a second pair on a legit playoff team, and Edmonton clearly needs kind of like a number 4 defenseman. So yeah, I think obviously you would want some kind of right-handed defenseman, but that's just really not out there as of right now. We actually do have a right-handed defenseman trade coming later for Edmonton in the video. But yeah, this could make sense. I guess you would would you throw him on the right side with Darnell Nurse? I don't know. But Edmonton definitely needs to improve their defense core if they're not going to do anything massive in terms of the goaltending. Next up, a March Hockey 09. Trevor Zegras, Jackson Lacombe, and a 2025 second-round pick for Noah Dobson. This is definitely interesting. I think I would maybe do this if I was an Islanders fan. Not really because of Zegras, who I've been high on in prior years. Jackson Lacombe has been like sneaky, very, very good this season. You thought Zellweger and Minchikov were going to be their defensemen of the future. Right now, it's looking like Jackson Lacombe. He has like 26 points in 50 games or something like that, playing of late like big number 1, 22 to 23 minutes a night. He's been very good. So that's what really intrigues me in this deal. It's not even, although I think Trevor Zegras can be rehabbed back to being a 60 to 65 point guy. That's the real piece. That's why I think Anaheim maybe doesn't want to do this, just because they have so much faith in Jackson Lacombe. But yeah, no, Dobson, without a doubt, in this trade is the best player. So maybe they just say, let's just get a surefire top pair right-handed defenseman that is extremely valuable in the NHL. I think it's a decent deal for both parties. But yeah, I think maybe if I was Anaheim, I would say no to this. Or maybe I would say take the second round pick out of it just because we value Lacombe so much. The Toronto Maple Leafs, Wilson says Jake Evans. Sorry, I was thinking about Jackson Lacombe again. Jake Evans for a second round pick. So Montreal to Toronto. Not sure that this would happen, but I think the going rate for Jake Evans will be a late second-round pick, probably early third round. Canadian fans were hyping him up way too much at the start of the season when he was like shooting 27%. They're like, oh, he's developed so much. No, he's a very good third liner, very good bottom sixer. But yeah, clearly that start to the season was a little bit fluky considering his on-ice shooting percentage. But yeah, I think Jake Evans is going to be a valuable name out there. If I'm the Montreal Canadiens, I'm trading him. Although you do have a shit ton of picks and prospects, I think you trade him for some picks and then package that for a younger roster player that's team controlled instead of paying Jake Evans after a career offensive season. For Toronto, that would make some sense in terms of a nice move to bolster your bottom six, because that is probably the biggest. We obviously not having a number 1 defense is probably the biggest weakness, but you can't fix that. Bottom six probably is the biggest weakness as of right now. Another bottom 6 deal for Toronto. Adib says Lawton to Toronto for a first round pick, Voigt and Yarncroc. I think Scott Laughton might get a first round pick. He shouldn't, but like he's what GMs love. A physical third liner that's only making $3 million in the next 2.5 seasons. It would be a second and a third probably. Like you might call me crazy for that, but considering he does have term, I think there's been a bidding war for Scott Laughton in prior trade deadlines. They ended up not trading him. I think they might finally pull the trigger on that. And again, although Toronto Maple Leafs fans would hate it, I don't think I wouldn't give up a first round pick for him. I think it's definitely on the table. Scott Laughton potentially going to Toronto. And that would be a solid add in terms of improving the team because, again, that bottom six is a little bit concerning. Sam Collins says, Erik Karlsson back to the Sens for Thomas Chabot in a first-round pick. Not sure if the cap would work. I think a Karlsson for Chabot swap just straight up would get it done. I don't think they would have to attach a first-round pick. Barring unless there's serious retention on Erik Karlsson, if Pittsburgh half retains his $10 million and you only get him for $5 million, yeah, you're gonna have to give up some serious money. But at $8 million, Karlsson's at 10 right now, so I guess the Penguins would have to retain a little bit. But yeah, if I'm Pittsburgh, I'd probably move off Erik Karlsson for Thomas Chabot, who's still only 27 years old. You can maybe flip him down the line. He still has some term left at $8 million. And if you're the Ottawa Senators, you get your GOAT, arguably not Daniel Alfredsson is the GOAT right now for the Ottawa Senators, but their greatest defenseman of all time. I think he could be a very good fit in Ottawa in terms of that legit number one offensive defenseman. Jake Sanderson's number one overall defenseman, but in terms of a power play specialist, second pair right-handed guy, I like Karlsson back in Ottawa. Again, maybe just a Karlsson for Chabot, but even then, Chabot's been frustrating at times this year, but still only 27 years old. I don't know if I would fully go through this. Maybe revisit it in the offseason, considering some of the injuries that they're dealing with. Next up, B. Porter, 203. Carlo to Edmonton for Savoy and a second-round pick. If Boston's willing to sell, I think that this is an awesome deal for both parties, honestly, considering Brandon Carlo is that ideal, maybe second pair defenseman partner for Darnell Nurse. He's been very underrated in prior years as a physical defensive defenseman. And if you're Boston, you can get a guy like Matt Savoy that's been very productive in the AHL, as well as dominating the WHL in prior seasons. Get some skill within your young farm system in a second-round pick. I would definitely sign up probably for both parties on this. Although Edmonton, you definitely want Matthew Savoy long-term. Obviously, right now, the next 2 to 3 years is what matters the most. Carlos signed the next 2.5 years at a reasonable $4.1 million. So, yeah. Now that Hampus Lindholm's out for the rest of the season, probably, maybe Boston says, oh, we're done with the season. But granted, Carlo, again, does have term on his deal and is only 28 years old. But maybe something like this happens. I don't expect anything like this to happen, but I think it is a fair deal for both parties. Next up, Donovan MJ3, Kyle Palmieri to Tampa for Mitchell Chaffee, a second-round pick and a B-level prospect. Yeah, I'd be down for this. I don't know the Tampa Bay Lightning prospects off the top of my head, but give us your fourth or fifth best prospect in a second-round pick in Chaffee. I'm down. We'll retain 50%. Kyle Palmieri, I love him, Long Island native. I think they're probably going to re-sign Kyle Palmieri, if I'm going to be honest, just because he is that local kid. I think he's going to take some kind of discount. Maybe we ship out Brock Nelson instead. But yeah, I would definitely be down for this. I think Kyle Palmieri's second-round pick makes a lot of sense for a solid 25 and 25 kind of guy, physical presence, net front crasher. Yeah, I think Kyle Palmieri is going to have a heavy market. Will they end up trading him? We'll see. I think he'd be a really good fit for Tampa Bay within their third line, considering that top six is loaded, but we look at that bottom six and it kind of looks like shit. That's their clear biggest weakness heading into the playoffs. But yeah, I think Kyle Palmieri would be a very good fit in Tampa Bay. Next up, Brock Nelson in a second-round pick to Colorado for Casey Middlestat. Dude, I think that the second-round pick might have to be flipped, or maybe it would have to be a one-for-one swap. I don't know why the New York Islanders would really want Casey Middlestat that much, considering how shit he's been. I can get down with the idea of just a one-for-one swap. Casey Middlestat's younger, signed the next 2 years of $5.75 million versus Brock's going to need some kind of 4 to 5 year deal, maybe at around $6 million. But yeah, the Islanders giving up assets to move off Brock Nelson for a guy that right now is inferior to Brock Nelson doesn't make a lot of sense in my opinion. So yeah, if it was Brock Nelson for Casey Middlestat, a second-round pick, I think that'd be a fair deal for both parties, considering Colorado badly needs that second-line center. And I know that Brock Nelson has not been playing to the level that we saw in his prior 3 years, but I bet on him bouncing back more than Casey Middlestat at this point. Then we got a Oilers-Gibson trade. Gibson for Stuart Skinner, Kapanen, Jeff Skinner, and a mid to late round pick. I think that would have to be a second-round pick for the going back to the Anaheim Ducks. Stuart Skinner does have some value. I think he's a little bit overhated because he's only making $2.6 million this year, and I think for 2 more seasons after this. So Anaheim would want a Stuart Skinner as the backup to Dashdell. If they trade Gibson, they need to get some kind of guy to play with Dashdell. Dashdell's not some proven commodity. And even regardless, you need a guy to play 25, 30 games. But yeah, the 2 Skinners and a second-round pick for Gibson, considering Gibson, although he's killing it this year, still makes $6.4 million for the next 2 seasons after this. There is still some inherent risk with John Gibson. But yeah, I think this would be a really good deal for both parties. Anaheim would get a cheap, cost-controlled, young-ish still, like Stuart Skinner's only still like 26, 27 years old, backup for Dashdell. And if anything happens to Dashdell, Stuart Skinner can fill in. Maybe they could flip Jeff Skinner. This could be some kind of 3-team deal where they also get a 3rd-round pick for Jeff Skinner. So basically for Gibson, they get a 2nd and a 3rd-round pick in a cheap backup goalie. Could make sense. And in cap-wise, that would make sense with Stewart's $3 million and Skinner's $3 million and Skinner's $2.6 million. Next up, another one from A March Hockey 09 was on a heater. Nikolai Ehlers for Brock Nelson in a 1st-round pick. I would probably do this if I was an Islanders fan. I think Ehlers, lock him up on some kind of 8x8. Yeah, he's great this year. He's been far better than Brock Nelson and is far younger. And if you're Winnipeg, you get a 1st-round pick that you can maybe flip also at the deadline to improve the team. Because I do think that there is a slight decrease in terms of Ehlers to Brock Nelson. But maybe you can sign Brock Nelson on some kind of cheap deal. He's from Minnesota, but he's from War Road, right up basically at the border. So he's just as close to Winnipeg. Maybe he would take some kind of hometown discount. And yeah, if you're the New York Islanders, you get a far more dynamic offensive player. And I think Barzal and Ehlers on a potential line with that skating ability would be freaking disgusting. And then we got another one that's basically the flip side of that. Rantanen to Winnipeg, and Carolina gets Ehlers in a 2025 1st-round pick. So yeah, now instead of Winnipeg getting slightly worse and picking up a 1st-round pick, they get slightly better and trade a 1st-round pick. I don't know if I would do this if I was Winnipeg, just because, again, I'm not sure Rantanen would, compared to Nelson, where I think there's a serious chance that you could re-sign him. I think if Rantanen got traded to Winnipeg, he'd be like, nah, I'm out of here unless you did pay him like $14 million. And in terms of messing up the chemistry mid-season, could be a little bit, although I think Rantanen, again, is a better player than Ehlers. You look at that second line with Perfetti, they've really developed a nice chemistry. I don't know if I would fully do something like that. I think something like a Brock Nelson, where you know that Ehlers isn't going to re-sign, and you can bring in a guy that you'd have for another 2 to 3 years, would maybe make a little bit more sense in terms of trading a 1st-round pick to upgrade in terms of talent, but maybe you lose some chemistry. That's just my overall thoughts. But let me know in the comments, what do you think about these trades? I thought you guys sent some really, really damn good ones. Follow me on Instagram so you don't miss something like this, that you could submit it in. And I'll be seeing you in the next one, 12 days until the deadline. Get the hell ready.